Your question about...
Tell us about why you think these issues matter in the time and the space that we're in today in our country and our context.
Well, they matter because they're still life and death issues, aren't they? These are not small issues. These are not minor issues. These are not light, superficial issues. These are things that have gravity. These are things that affect people, affect families and whole communities. However you frame out the problem, which we will talk about here, what can't be denied is the colossal, almost oppressive bearing down of weight on people. And that expresses itself in what someone thought was a harmless conversation in the break room that turned out to be an explosion between two people along the lines of race or racial understanding. And that expresses itself in public policy. There's a long history of public policy addressing and impacting these kinds of issues. So these things matter, and they matter for all of us. And one of the things we have to understand is that the conversations we have about race isn't sort of, I think sometimes when people hear even the word race, what comes to mind is black people, as if white people aren't in a, to use the language, a racial group, sure. Right? And I think the language is problematic for the reasons you stated in the introduction. But as if white people don't embody some kind of racial class and standing. And so these stories are American stories. What happened to Tamir Rice and John Crawford, what happened to Eric Garner and Mike Brown, what happened to these persons isn't simply the story of those individuals or their families or their communities. It's our collective story. If we don't sort of roll up our sleeves and grapple with these life and death issues in a way that faces them honestly, with the resources and the hope of the gospel, then there's not much hope for us.
And Thabiti, wouldn't you say those stories frame how we see other stories?
Absolutely.
Well, let's talk about some of that framing, because Thabiti, you specifically and articulately have addressed and really aggressively addressed the grand jury testimony. You've spoken about the concerns about the process and about the injustice. Where Bryan, you of course been writing at the Gospel Coalition site, which is one of our co-sponsors, along with the Kindness Movement and with Lifeways Ministry Grid. You wrote, and I think the first thing you wrote was at my site at Christianity Today, and you didn't. Your whole issue, I think we titled it, but was you should care about Ferguson despite the facts. Right. There are issues that are bigger than this, and Voddie, you took a very different approach, and we kind of joked beforehand that would be a minority approach, sort of on this panel in this conversation.
Yeah, but I think that's an overstatement.
I think that's an overstatement. That's true.
I'm that dude.
You're that guy.
I'm all by myself.
All right. But I think it's important to note there's not an African American view. Yeah. Like there's not an Anglo view or a Latino view or ever else it may be. So let's talk a little bit. Voddie, to you, how do you frame this issue? Your article, was I believe it crashed the Gospel Coalition site. It was read so widely. You ended up on Fox News, which even that phrase has cultural connotations and challenges all around it.
Right. They weren't the only ones who invited.
They were not the only ones. Exactly. There was actually some. Thabiti responded, but also there were stronger responses from a group of 4 African American leaders, Ephraim Smith and Christina Cleveland, I happen to know, and 2 others I don't know. But they called your article "black on black violence."
Oh yeah.
So talk to me about.
And there are people who have called for the editor at the Gospel Coalition to be fired.
Yes.
For publishing my article.
So what was the point of your article? And based on the reaction, any thoughts on the reaction thus far?
Yeah, many thoughts. But let me just put this in context. Let me put my response in context. I grew up in South Central Los Angeles during the 70s and 80s, in the heyday of crack wars, Uzis, drive-bys, so on and so forth. And there were these 2 ideas that were held in tension for us, especially for young black men in that community. On the one idea, there was this hatred toward and distrust of law enforcement, just undoubtedly. The LAPD was understood to be the biggest gang in LA, all right? But on the other hand, there was this sense when something would happen, when a young black man, especially one of, gangbangers or something like that, when something would happen to one of them, there would be older black people in the community, unfortunately, usually women, who would sit us down and say, that's why you don't live like that. That's what saved me. It's those people who sat me down and said, regardless of what we believe about all this other stuff going on, that's why you don't live like that. That was the check that I had. And that is a significant part of our cultural tradition. That check that says we don't live like that. And so for me, one of the points that I was trying to make, and which is why I brought it around to my 7 sons, is that for me, when I look at this, regardless of all of the other issues surrounding it and facts that are being disputed and debated and whatnot, for me, one of the things that we have to keep in mind is the fact that Eric Garner, Mike Brown, they were not Martin Luther King Jr. They were not. There is a difference. There is a distinction between individuals who are living lives that represent what we are fighting for and individuals who are living lives that represent what we are trying to rise above. And so for me, that was the note that was important to be hit that I felt like wasn't being hit.
Right. It wasn't just that. You also said, though, it taught me an unfortunate lesson. The greatest threat to me was other black men.
Yes.
And you spoke on issue of black-on-black crime. You quoted some statistics that later people would critique and say people tend to kill their neighbors who tend to live in white neighborhoods and predominantly black neighborhoods. But
but nowhere near at the rate.
But we'd say there's disproportionate
absolutely.
as well. So
not even the same kinds of crimes.
So I don't think a lot of people would disagree with what you said a minute ago. But some other things you said in the article were basically Michael Brown maybe got what he deserved as too strong of a language.
I said he reaped what he sowed.
Reaped what he sowed.
And I mentioned there was a theme in my article of violence. I talked about fatherlessness and violence and so on and so forth. Then I talked about a violent attack in a store and a life that ended in violence.
Yeah.
I thought it was kind of a little bit cheap for people to say, oh, so you steal some cigarettes, you deserve to get killed. That's being completely and utterly dishonest with what I wrote. It's obvious I'm talking about the violence.
Yeah, well, let me say, Thabiti, in his response, said, and I don't know if specifically in response, it was in an article you responded to some of the responses to Ferguson, quoting you said, Mike Brown doesn't deserve death because his father sinned against his mother. And if we regard him as fatherless, then we shouldn't be sneering and condemning, but actually more eager to see that justice for Brown is done. Talk us a little bit about your response to the situation, and really your response to Voddie's comments and his article as well.
Yeah, if I press through the tone of my brother's piece, there's a lot there that I would agree with. So I've spent most of my professional life as a social scientist working on family well-being issues. One of the things that's rare in the social sciences is that you ever get a research consensus. You just never get that. And the fact that you have that among liberals and conservatives and so on and so forth with regard to family structure and the positive outcomes for children raised by their biological parents, intact marriages, the fact that you get a premium for that those children do better, and everybody agrees on that in the research, that's colossal. That's in social science world, that's miraculous. So there's much that Voddie was pointing at that I go, okay, yeah, I see that. If I press through tones and so on, I see that. What I think Voddie's piece missed was the kind of framing he just gave it, because the kind of messages he got from the older women in his community were the messages I got from the older women in my community. So I got a whooping on the way home from school by my neighbor, and then she told my mom I got another whooping when I got home, because we weren't going to live like that.
Yeah.
That was missing in the piece. Instead, what we got was something that seemed to suggest quite the opposite, that endemic to African-American culture was this sort of criminal behavior, this kind of criminal culture and the glorifying of thug life. Now, you get that with Tupac, you get that with Biggie, you get that in hip-hop in some circles, but I think your post came dangerously close to characterizing the community that way. And I think that's an overstatement.
But
let me say just one other thing. And then I think the piece that troubled me most was, I'm cheering all the way in the beginning of the post. Yes, I'm a pastor. Why does my opinion matter? But I got one. I'm going to give it. I care most about my local church and local context. I'm just amening that all the way. And then you say, I'm going to give a gospel perspective. And honestly, brother, if I'm being honest, I don't think it's a cheap shot at all to say, when you then land with, he reaped what he sowed, you landed on the law, not the gospel. you landed on just desserts, not the grace of God in Jesus Christ, because as sinners, we're all treated better than we deserve, than our sins deserve. And so that was the piece that was most troubling for me with a brother I love and labor with, and could understand where you were coming from in many perspectives. And so I think we need to sort of, if we're going to have this conversation, we need to, know which conversation we're having. Are we having the police brutality conversation? That's one conversation. Or are we having the conversation about the community and difficulties and problems in the community? That's a different conversation. And what I keep seeing is the kind of pushback that inserts the community issues in the police brutality conversation as a way of denying the police brutality issues. And I'm saying, no, that's just completely illegitimate. Those are both important conversations to have. They both help us fill in the whole picture. And we need to fill in the whole picture if we're going to have an honest conversation and work on multiple fronts. But we can't use those things as ways of denying the other. So I can't talk about the injustice of the system as a way of denying the sort of family issues and moral responsibility issues. And we can't talk about the moral responsibility issues in a way to deny the system issues. And if we're going to bring the gospel to this, we've got to have in mind that our God treats us better than we deserve. And he has sent his son precisely because we're criminals and thieves and robbers. That's all that ever come before him, right? And it's those who say.
You're not a subtle man. And
yeah, but let me also say there's a difference between gospel content and gospel conclusion.
Right, I want you to share two things. Respond to Thabiti, but in hindsight, and it's okay, I mean, again, you're not a Wilton Flower man, you can just tell me no. In hindsight, would you have done anything different in the article? But first respond to Thabiti and then talk to me about hindsight.
Yeah, in hindsight, would I have done anything different in the article? Of course I would have done. Yeah, there's nothing I've ever written that I would do differently. But let me.
Something more than.
Yeah. But let me respond to Thabiti's point. There's a difference between lack of gospel content, lack of gospel conclusion. Where we talk about the gospel is not mandated. The conclusion there was for effect. The conclusion there was not to say that this is the message of the gospel, because there is no understanding of the message of the gospel without the law. And so, yeah, that was absolutely.
But the law is only the beginning.
You get no disagreement from me in that perspective. But my other point that I want to make here is that what I'm talking about is how we take these issues and how we lionize certain individuals who are not individuals to be lionized. How we take certain individuals and put their names on T-shirts, you know what I mean, to the exclusion of other individuals. Because there are other people who did not live those kinds of lives, who have also lost their lives. They're police officers. Death of police officers is up 65%. Where are their names on T-shirts? And I think when we shape things in this way, that's what keeps the division among us and between us. The other thing is, you said that there were these two ideas that we had to keep in context. You can't talk about these personal responsibility issues without talking about systemic issues. I reject that. I reject that completely. Well, you can absolutely do that.
Just to be clear, I didn't say that conceptually you can't do that. I said if you want a full picture, you have to talk about both. You don't have to talk about them at the same time even, but you have to put both of those things on the table.
I reject that as well. I reject that as well.
Why would you reject that?
Here's why I reject that. Because we're assuming.
Okay.
You see, we look at what happened to Mike Brown, and we assume that there was injustice there. That's an assumption, and that's part of the problem. Part of the problem is we sit around and we say, oh yeah, black folks, we know something like that happened. We know what happened. That's what I refer to as ethnic Gnosticism. Like we know why, because we black and black folks know what happened. Nobody has to tell me. I don't need a grand jury. I know what happened. No, we don't know what happened. We can't assume that there was injustice there.
For the good of my own soul, can I hear you riff? Is there in your worldview, because when I read your piece, the tone of it lacked empathy. It came across as if he got what he deserved.
Police officers didn't see it that way.
Right.
So it didn't lack empathy. It just lacked the kind of empathy that you might have been looking for.
Yeah,
but hold on one second. This is very important. In your worldview, is there any place for systemic injustice? Do you see that at all, structural injustice? Or is it all personal? If they'd have made better choices.
I think the question needs to be more specific than that. Because there is no system that is inherently just. That's obvious. But do I believe that the system is inherently rigged against black people? No, I don't.
Interesting.
No, I
Yeah,
don't. And I don't make that assumption
Brian,
when I see things happen.
I want to get you to respond, but I want to make sure that never has Matt Chandler sat so long on a panel without speaking. So true. That's actually true. It's really statistically true. It's kind of nice to see. Everything I say is statistically true. For the record. That's not true. Thabiti, if you want to respond, I want to give you a second to respond. Then I want to broaden the conversation and bring Matt and Darrin in.
Just a quick section.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Couple just bullet points. Number one, to remember a person isn't necessary to lionize a person. No one here is claiming that anyone, Eric Garner or Mike Brown, were Boy Scouts. I feel very much like I'm Mike Brown at 18. All the things that develop in the media profile about Mike Brown and the sort of thug narrative that developed, I'm going, I can check all those boxes. And yet, I
Matt and Darrin.
Just a quick section.
Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Couple just bullet points. Number one, to remember a person isn't necessary to lionize a person. No one here is claiming that anyone, Eric Garner or Mike Brown, were Boy Scouts. I feel very much like I'm Mike Brown at 18. All the things that develop in the media profile about Mike Brown and the sort of thug narrative that developed, I'm going, I can check all those boxes. And yet, I dare say that most people who know me now, given Christ's grace in my life, would say, you don't look like that guy at all. What I want for the Mike Browns is that opportunity to survive their teenage years and someone to say, you don't look like that kid at all. So that's not lionizing them. That's not equating them with Dr. King, who, by the way, wasn't Dr. King.
Right.
He had his issues too, right? It's not to be romantic about anybody. And so I just need to be clear about that. Secondly, I think it's deeply problematic to say that there is no systemic injustice along the lines of ethnicity and race in this country. The entire country has been predicated upon.
I don't know that he said there's no system. Did you say there's no system?
He says he rejects the category altogether.
Right,
Yeah, absolutely.
No. Okay, you just say there's
Absolutely.
no system.
I reject the category altogether. Yeah.
He's not a subtle man.
No.
You said that.
That's why we have a bi-ethnic man in the White House. Okay. That's why we have a black man as the chief legal officer in the United States.
So everything's all good
That's
now.
why
It's
we
all
have.
good
Come on now. Come on now. Can we at least be honest enough with one another to not go to elementary school and say that if you have something positive to say, you think there's nothing bad? Because I've already said that our system is not perfect. Right? I've already said that.
But you're saying imperfection.
What I'm saying is, it's not.
So
what I'm saying is, it's actually the opposite.
Let's go back to
We've got people bending over backwards on behalf of black people in this country. We've got people afraid of being called racist. Listen, in evangelical circles right now, we've got people who are saying on homosexuality, we need to sit down and talk together. On racism, no quarter. Huh?
People are saying
What
that
happened?
they shouldn't have conversations around
On race. No, a racist is not to be abided. There is no mercy. There is no. Again, we have to listen to everybody except Officer Wilson, because we don't need to get in his skin. We don't need to have coffee with him.
Okay, Thabiti,
we don't need to have.
Finish your statement. I want to bring in Matt Chandler.
Yeah, and we don't want to. We don't want this to be a grand jury on Voddie Baucham, right? Yeah, because we know he's going to get off, even though he's wrong. So just to finish.
That may be the tweet of the day. Right there.
Just to finish the thought.
Yeah,
here.
please.
I think it's ahistorical, and I think it's very close to willfully ignorant to argue that there are no systemic injustices in this country, either in its history or in its present.
Never argue that.
And to argue, great, so we're agreeing. So to argue that those things don't exist now, or to argue that because we have some high-profile exemplars, like the president, attorney general, so on and so forth, that those are things of the past. I think we rob ourselves of the sanctifying work of the gospel when the Spirit confronts us about this sin. Racism is just a species of alienation from the fall. It's a particular kind of alienation that operates systematically along the lines of ethnicity, skin color, and so on. If we don't face that, and aren't honest about our own hearts and honest about how those hearts get expressed in systems. Systems are run by people, all of whom are fallen, all of whom have the same proclivities that we have toward prejudice and bias and so on. If we're not honest about that, we're really robbing ourselves of the opportunity for the Spirit to move us along in really sanctifying ways.
But if all of those people,
a minute.
but if all of those people are biased, we have to acknowledge that all of those people and all of their ethnicities are biased.
Well, I think all people in all ethnicities have biases.
Exactly.
But
exactly. So everybody in the system, we're saying, is biased, because I think we're crossing categories here between personal racism, which no one would deny, and the idea that we have.
Well, let's go to the idea that we have systemic issues. And